So Samsung does something weird with their phones, where unlike Apple or Google, they actually use a different chipset inside of their phones depending on the country that you live in. This is like if Tesla were to use one motor for the Model 3 sold in country A, and then use a totally different motor for the Model 3 sold in country B, where one of those motors yields a faster 0 to 60 time and has a longer range. Of course, as far as I know, Tesla doesn't do anything like this, yet when it comes to Samsung and their Galaxy phones, this is pretty much an annual event. We've seen some pretty big differences between the two chipsets that they use, which are either Qualcomm Snapdragon chips for the Galaxy sold in countries like the US or Canada, or Samsung's own in-house Exynos chips for the Galaxy sold in other countries like in the UK, where almost every year, one of them ends up being faster, having longer battery life, and sometimes even taking better photos. Now, in recent years, it's been the Snapdragon versions that have been better, which understandably for the people in countries that get the Exynos version has been frustrating. We see it in the comments all the time, and there's even a petition on change.org with almost 50,000 signatures at this point asking Samsung to stop using the Exynos chips altogether. But here's the thing, I don't think that the Exynos chip in and of itself is the real problem, because while in the recent past the Exynos chips have obviously been inferior, just 5 or 6 years ago the situation was reversed, where the Snapdragon versions were worse. So, really, I think at the heart of the issue is not that Samsung uses an Exynos chip or that Samsung uses a Snapdragon chip, but it's that Samsung uses both, which not only leads to one group of Galaxy owners inevitably being disappointed with performance, but it also has some hidden costs that affect all Galaxy owners that don't really get that much attention. So for one, by having two different chipsets with different capabilities, Samsung can't take full advantage of either. If the Exynos chip, for example, 1 year supports 4K video recording at 120 frames, but the Snapdragon chip doesn't, well, Samsung can't ship that feature only on the Exynos versions, or else everybody in the Snapdragon camp would get upset, which kind of puts Samsung in this lose-lose position. On one hand, it's the lack of parity that gets people upset for things that Samsung really can't control. Like, you can't make phones perform equally if they don't have the same processor. And then on the other hand, it's the forced parity in terms of the feature set that could be holding back Galaxy phones. But beyond just features, there also has to be some cost to supporting two different chipsets year in and year out, where if Samsung's software team was instead focused on a single chip, maybe we'd see better optimization, or maybe software updates would roll out faster, or maybe the phones would be supported for longer, like who knows. But the point is, at least from a consumer standpoint, using two different chipsets just doesn't seem to make sense, which begs the question of why? Like, why the heck does Samsung insist on using both? Well, only Samsung knows the answer to that question, but we can speculate. And if we break the question down into two parts, it might help us land closer to the truth. So the first part of the question is, why does Samsung use Snapdragon chips, right? Like, they have their own Exynos line, why did they go with a third-party chip? Well, after doing a little bit of research, there's a few reasons that seem to make sense. The first is, it could just be that it's cheaper for Samsung to use these Snapdragon chips in countries where they rely on Qualcomm's modems, since Qualcomm has a bunch of patents around CDMA and 4G, to the point where even the iPhone uses Qualcomm's modems. So for Samsung, it might make more sense to go with the Snapdragon SoC entirely instead of using the Exynos chip plus paying extra for the Qualcomm modem. Which, hey, that kind of makes sense, and some people have pushed forward that theory. Now, the second potential reason is Qualcomm's a big customer for Samsung's foundry business, with Samsung manufacturing a large percentage of Qualcomm's chips, including the Snapdragon. So it could be that Samsung is using the Snapdragon as a form of sweetening the deal for Qualcomm to keep them from going with a competing foundry. But I guess we'll see how valid this is next year, with reports suggesting that Qualcomm won't be using Samsung's foundries for their next-gen chips. And then finally, the third reason, which is not as relevant today as it was back then, is the Qualcomm partnership may have given Samsung an advantage over their Android competitors, where brands like HTC and LG, who relied heavily on Qualcomm chips or on Snapdragon chips since they didn't make their own processors, would have to wait until after Samsung phones were released before they would have enough supply to ship their own phones. This doesn't seem to be the case anymore since LG and HTC are out of the picture, and we've seen smaller brands get first dibs on these Snapdragon chips, but back then when things were much more competitive in the smartphone market, it might have played a significant role. But let's flip the question over now, which is, if the Qualcomm deal was so great for Samsung, then why did they even bother going with the Exynos chip to begin with? Again, while nobody knows for sure, there are a few reasons that might make sense. So number one is, at its core, Samsung is a hardware company. While a good chunk of their business comes from their mobile phones, a lot of their profit comes from their memory and display sales. And I'm sure that having their own in-house chip where they can eventually sell them to other manufacturers is at least part of Samsung's long-term game plan. And then potential reason number two is having the Exynos chips and continuing to develop them gives Samsung real leverage at the negotiating table with Qualcomm, which possibly allows them to cut better deals on the Snapdragon chips than other manufacturers get, which only makes it harder for those manufacturers to compete with Samsung's phones. And then finally, having the Exynos chip also serves as a good backup plan for Samsung, just in case something goes wrong. Now, we already saw this play out back in 2015 when Samsung released the Galaxy S6, where they decided not to use the Snapdragon 810, which was having overheating issues, and instead use the Exynos chip on all Galaxy S6s around the world. And considering that Samsung is the biggest smartphone manufacturer on the planet, it makes sense for them to have a backup plan and not be over-dependent on any one provider. Now, just to be clear, all of this stuff is just speculation. But the fact is, at least up until now, it has obviously made sense for Samsung to use two different chipsets. Otherwise, they wouldn't, right? Like, behavior doesn't lie. And while from a consumer standpoint, this is frustrating, especially for people who, again, get the inferior chip that year on their smartphone, I'm gonna throw a curveball at you and say that maybe, just maybe, the downsides are still worth it in the end. Now, hear me out for a second. So if something is good for Samsung, which we presume that using two processors is, considering they keep doing it, then naturally it follows that it could also be good for Samsung's products. Because if Samsung generates more revenue, then that also means there's more revenue that could be reinvested back into research and development. And that extra R&D could be why we've seen Samsung put out better and better products year in and year out, and why they've taken bets on things like folding phones. Now, we don't know for sure if this is at all the case, but I just figured it's an argument worth considering. But at the end of the day, until Samsung stops using two different chipsets, it's always gonna feel like a problem. You know, how big of a problem that is really depends on how much you even care. Most consumers don't even know that Samsung uses two different chipsets. And you know, credit where credit is due, Samsung has done a pretty good job at making their two variants closer in performance than they have in the past. So unless the wild rumors out there saying that Samsung's gonna go all in with the Snapdragon next year turn out to be true, it's likely that we're gonna continue seeing two different variants every single year, for better or for worse. But what do you guys think? Do you think Samsung should just ditch one of the chips and go all in with one? Or do you think this whole issue is kind of overblown and really it's not that big of a deal? Let me know down below in the comments. But anyways, that is it for me in this video. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the very next episode.